Yeah, I certainly agree that extremism is I would think about it more as a symptom and a big issue that needs to be worked on. But I think the bigger question is making sure that everyone has a sense of purpose, has a role that they feel matters, and social connections. Because at the end of the day, we're social animals, and I think it's easy in our theoretical thinking to abstract that away. But that's such a fundamental part of who we are. So that's why I focus on that. I don't know, do you want to move over to some of the AI issues? Because I think that's or do you want to stick on this topic for a second?
No, I mean, this topic is closely connected to AI. Again, because I think that, one of the disservices that science fiction, and I'm a huge fan of science fiction, but I think it has done some pretty bad things, which is to focus attention on the wrong scenarios and the wrong dangers. That people think, oh, AI is dangerous because the robots are coming to kill us. And this is extremely unlikely, that we'll face a robot rebellion. I'm much more frightened about robots always obeying orders than about robots rebelling against the humans. I think the two main problems with AI, and we can explore this in greater depth, is what I just mentioned. First, increasing inequality between different parts of the world, because you'll have some countries which lead and dominate the new AI economy, and this is such a huge advantage that it kind of trumps everything else. And we will see, I mean, if we had the Industrial Revolution creating this huge gap between a few industrial powers and everybody else, and then it took 150 years to close the gap. And over the last few decades, the gap has been closed or closing, as more and more countries which were far behind are catching up. Now the gap may reopen and be much worse than ever before because of the rise of AI and because AI is likely to be dominated by just a small number of countries. So that's one issue, AI and inequality. And the other issue is AI and human agency, or even the meaning of human life. What happens when AI is mature enough and you have enough data to basically hack human beings, and you have an AI that knows me better than I know myself and can make decisions for me, predict my choices, manipulate my choices, and authority increasingly shifts from humans to algorithms. So not only decisions about which movie to see, but even decisions like which community to join, who to befriend, whom to marry. We increasingly rely on the recommendations of the AI, and what does it do to human life and human agency? So these I would say the two most important issues of AI inequality and AI and human agency.
Yeah. And I think both of them get down to a similar question around values, right? And who's building this, and what are the values that are encoded, and how does that end up playing out? Yeah, I tend to think that in a lot of the conversations around AI, we almost personify AI, right? Your point around killer robots or something like that. But I actually think AI is very connected to the general tech sector, right? So almost every technology product and increasingly a lot of not what you call technology products are made better in some way by AI. So it's not like AI is a monolithic thing that you build. It powers a lot of products. So it's a lot of economic progress and can get towards some of the distribution of opportunity questions that you're raising. But it also is fundamentally interconnected with these really socially important questions around data and privacy and how we want our data to be used, and what are the policies around that, and what are the global frameworks. And so one of the big questions that, so I tend to agree with a lot of the questions that you're raising, which is that a lot of the countries that have the ability to invest in future technology, of which AI and data and future internet technologies are certainly an important area, are doing that because it will give their local companies an advantage in the future, right? And to be the ones that are exporting services around the world. I tend to think that right now, the United States has a major advantage that a lot of the global technology platforms are made here, and certainly a lot of the values that are encoded in that are shaped largely by American values. They're not only. I mean, speaking for Facebook, I mean, we serve people around the world and we take that very seriously. But certainly ideas like giving everyone a voice, that's something that is probably very shaped by the American ideas around free speech and strong adherence to that. So I think culturally and economically, there's an advantage for countries to develop, to kind of push forward the state of the field and have the companies that in the next generation are the strongest companies in that. So certainly you see different countries trying to do that. And this is very tied up in not just economic prosperity and inequality,
do they have
but
a
also
real chance? I mean, does a country like Honduras, Ukraine, Yemen has any real chance of joining the AI race, or are they already out? I mean, it's not going to happen in Yemen. It's not going to happen in Honduras. And then what happens to them in 20 years or 50 years?
Some of this gets down to the values around how it's developed, though. What is, I think that there are certain advantages that countries with larger populations have, because you can get to critical mass in terms of universities and industry and investment and things like that. But one of the values that we here, right, both at Facebook and I think generally in the academic system of trying to do research, hold is that you do open research, right? So a lot of the work that's getting invested into into these advances, in theory, if this works well, should be more open. So then you can have an entrepreneur in one of these countries that you're talking about, which maybe isn't a whole industry-wide thing, and certainly I think you'd bet against sitting here today that in the future all of the AI companies are going to be in a given small country. But I don't think it's far-fetched to believe that there will be an entrepreneur in some place who can use Amazon Web Services to spin up instances for compute, who can hire people across the world in a globalized economy, and can leverage research that has been done in the US or across Europe or in different open academic institutions or companies that increasingly are publishing their work that are pushing the state-of-the-art forward on that. So I think that there's this big question about what we want the future to look like. And part of the way that I think we want the future to look is we want it to be open. We want the research to be open. I think we want the internet to be a platform. And this gets back to your unification point versus fragmentation. One of the big risks, I think, for the future is that the internet policy in each country ends up looking different and ends up being fragmented. And if that's the case, then I think the entrepreneur in the countries that you're talking about in Honduras probably doesn't have as big of a chance if they can't leverage all the advances that are happening everywhere. But if the internet stays one thing and the research stays open, then I think that they have a much better shot. So when I look towards the future, one of the things that I just get very worried about is the values that I just laid out are not values that all countries share. And when you get into some of the more authoritarian countries and their data policies, they're very different from the kind of regulatory frameworks that across Europe and across a lot of other people are talking about or have put into place. And just to put a finer point on it, and recently I've come out and I've been very vocal that I think that more countries should adopt a privacy framework like GDPR in Europe. And a lot of people, I think, have been confused about this. They're like, well, why are you arguing for more privacy regulation? Why now, given that in the past you weren't as positive on it? And I think part of the reason why I am so focused on this now is I think at this point, people around the world recognize that these questions around data and AI and technology are important. So there's going to be a framework in every country. I mean, it's not like there's not going to be regulation or policy. So I actually think the bigger question is, what is it going to be? And the most likely alternative to to each country adopting something that encodes the freedoms and rights of something like GDPR, in my mind, the most likely alternative is the authoritarian model, which is currently being spread, which says, as every company needs to store everyone's data locally in data centers, and if I'm a government, I should be able to go send my military there and be able to access whatever data I want, and be able to take that for surveillance or military or helping local military industrial companies. And I just think that that's a really bad future, right? That's not the direction that I, as someone who's building one of these internet services, or just as a citizen of the world, want to see the world going.
Yeah, to be the devil's advocate for a moment, if I look at it from the viewpoint, let's say, of India. So I listened to the American president saying America first, and I'm a nationalist, I'm not a globalist, I care about the interests of America, and I wonder, is it safe to store the data about Indian citizens in the US and not in India, when they're openly saying they care only about themselves? So why should it be in America and not in India?
Well, I think that there's the motives matter, and certainly I don't think that either of us would consider India to be an authoritarian country that has. So I would say that.
It can still say we want data and metadata on Indian users to be stored on Indian soil. We don't want it to be stored on American soil or somewhere else.
Yeah, and I can understand the arguments for that, and I think that the intent matters, right? And I think countries can come at this with open values and still conclude that something like that could be helpful. But I think one of the things that you need to be very careful about is that if you set that precedent, you're making it very easy for other countries that don't have open values and that are much more authoritarian and want the data not to protect their citizens, but to be able to surveil them and find dissidents and lock them up. So I think
I agree. But I think that it really boils down to the questions that do we trust America? And given the past 2-3 years, people in more and more places around the world. Previously, say if we were sitting here 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 40 years ago, then America declared itself to be the leader of the free world. We can argue a lot whether this was the case or not, or at least on the declaratory level, this was how America presented itself to the world. We are the leaders of the free world, so trust us, we care about freedom. But now we see a different America. America which doesn't want even to be, again, it's not a question of even what they do, but how America presents itself no longer as the leader of the free world, but as a country which is interested above all in itself and in its own interests. And just this morning, for instance, I read that the US is considering having a veto on the UN resolution against using sexual violence as a weapon of war. And the US is the one that thinks of vetoing this. And as somebody who is not a citizen of the US, I ask myself, can I still trust America to be the leader of the free world if America itself says, I don't want this role anymore?
Well, I think that that's a somewhat separate question from the direction that the internet goes in, because GDPR, the framework that I'm advocating, that it would be better if more countries adopted something like this, because I think that that's just significantly better than the alternatives, a lot of which are these more authoritarian models. GDPR originated in Europe, right? So it's not an American invention. And I think in general, these values of openness in research, of cross-border flow of ideas and trade, that's not an American idea, right? That's a global philosophy for how the world should work. And I think that the alternatives to that are, at best, fragmentation, right, which breaks down the global model on this. At worst, a growth in authoritarianism for the models of how this gets adopted. And and that's where I think that the precedents on some of this stuff get really tricky. I mean, you're I think doing a good job of playing devil's advocate in the conversation because you're bringing all of the counter arguments that I think someone with good intent might bring to argue, hey, maybe a different set of data policies is something that we should consider. The thing that I just worry about is that what we've seen is that once a country puts that in place, that's a precedent that then a lot of other countries that might be more authoritarian use to basically be a precedent to argue that they should do the same things, and then that spreads, and I think that that's bad, right? And that's one of the things that that is the person running this company. I'm quite committed to making sure that we play our part in pushing back on that and keeping the internet as one platform. So I mean, one of the most important decisions that I think I get to make is the person running this company is where are we going to build our data centers and store data? Mm-hmm. And we've made the decision that we're not going to put data centers in countries that we think have weak rule of law, where people's data may be improperly accessed, and that could put people in harm's way. And you know, I mean, there have been a lot of questions around the world around questions of censorship, and I think that those are really serious and important. I mean, a lot of the reason why I build what we build is because I care about giving everyone a voice, giving people as much voice as possible. So I don't want people to be censored. At some level, these questions around data and how it's used and whether authoritarian governments get access to it, I think are even more sensitive because if you can't say something that you want, that is highly problematic. That violates your human rights, I think, in a lot of cases. Mm-hmm. It stops progress. But if a government can get access to your data, then it can identify who you are and go lock you up and hurt you and hurt your family and cause real physical harm in ways that are just really deep. So I do think that people running these companies have an obligation to try to push back on that, mm-hmm. and fight establishing precedents which will be harmful, even if a lot of the initial countries that are talking about some of this have good intent. I think that this can easily go off the rails. Mm-hmm. And when you talk about in the future AI and data, which are two concepts that are just really tied together, I just think the values that comes from, and whether it's part of a more global system, a more democratic process, a more open process, that's one of our best hopes for having this work out well. If it comes from repressive or authoritarian countries, then I just think that's going to be highly problematic in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, that raises the question of how do we build AI in such a way that it's not inherently a tool of surveillance and manipulation and control? I mean, this goes back to the idea of creating something that knows you better than you know yourself, which is kind of the ultimate surveillance and control tool. And we are building it now in different places around the world. It's being built. And what are your thoughts about how to build an AI which serves individual people and protects individual people, and not an AI which can easily, with a flip of a switch, becomes kind of the ultimate surveillance tool?
Well, I think that is more about the values and the policy framework than the technological development. I mean, it's a lot of the research that's happening in AI are just very fundamental mathematical methods where a researcher will create an advance, and now all of the neural networks will be 3% more efficient. I'm just kind of throwing this out, and that means that newsfeed will be a little bit better for people. Our systems for detecting things like hate speech will be a little bit better. But our ability to find photos of you that you might want to review will be better. But all these systems get a little bit better. So now I think the bigger question is you have places in the world where governments are choosing to use that technology and those advances for things like widespread face recognition and surveillance. Mm-hmm. And those countries, I mean, China's doing this, they create a real feedback loop, which advances the state of that technology, where they say, okay, well, we want to do this, so now there's a set of companies that are sanctioned to go do that and are getting access to a lot of data to do it because it's allowed and encouraged. So that is advancing and getting better and better. That's not a mathematical process. That's kind of a policy process that they want to go in that direction. Those are the values, and it's an economic process of the feedback loop and development of those things compared to in countries that might say, hey, that kind of surveillance isn't what we want. Those companies just don't exist as much, right? Or don't get as much support.
I don't know. In my home country of Israel is, at least for Jews, it's a democracy, and it's one of the leaders of the world in surveillance technology. And we basically have one of the biggest laboratories of surveillance technology in the world, which is the occupied territories. And exactly these kinds of systems are being developed there and exported all over the world. So given my personal experience back home, again, I don't necessarily trust that just because a society in its own inner workings is, say, democratic, that it will not develop and spread these kinds of technologies.
Yeah, I agree. It's not clear that a democratic process alone solves it, but I do think that it is mostly a policy question, right? A government can quite easily make the decision that they don't want to support that kind of surveillance, and then the companies that they would be working with to support that kind of surveillance would be out of business, and then, or at the very least, have much less economic incentive to continue that technological progress. So that dimension of the growth of the technology gets stunted compared to others, and that's generally the process that I think you want to follow broadly, right? Technological advance isn't by itself good or bad. I think it's the job of the people who are shepherding it, building it, and making policies around it to have policies and make sure that their effort goes towards amplifying the good and mitigating the negative use cases. And that's how I think you end up bending these industries and these technologies to be things that are positive for humanity overall. And I think that's a normal process that happens with most technologies that get built. But I think what we're seeing in some of these places is not the natural mitigation of negative uses. In some cases, the economic feedback loop is pushing those things forward, but I don't think it has to be that way. But I think that that's not as much a technological decision as it is a policy decision.
I fully agree, but I mean, every technology can be used in different ways, for good or for bad. You can use the radio to broadcast music to people, and you can use the radio to broadcast Hitler giving a speech to millions of Germans. The radio doesn't care. The radio just carries whatever you put in it. So yeah, it is a policy decision, but then it just raises the question, how do we make sure that the policies are the right policies in a world when it is becoming more and more easy to manipulate and control people on a massive scale like never before? I mean, the new technology, it's not just that we invented technology and then we have good democratic countries and bad authoritarian countries, and the question is, what do they do with the technology? The technology itself could change the balance of power between democratic and totalitarian systems. And I fear that the new technologies are giving an inherent advantage, not necessarily overwhelming, but they do tend to give an inherent advantage to totalitarian regimes, because the biggest problem of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, which eventually led to their downfall, is that they couldn't process the information efficiently enough. If you think about the Soviet Union, so you have this model, an information processing model, which basically says we take all the information from the entire country, move it to one place, to Moscow, there it gets processed, decisions are made in one place, and transmitted back as commands. This was the Soviet model of information processing. And versus the American version, which was, no, we don't have a single center. We have a lot of organizations and a lot of individuals and businesses, and they can make their own decisions. In the Soviet Union, there is somebody in Moscow if I live in some small farm or kolkhoz in Ukraine, there is somebody in Moscow who tells me how many radishes to grow this year, because they know. And in America, I decide for myself with, I get signals from the market and I decide. And the Soviet model just didn't work well because of the difficulty of processing so much information quickly with 1950s technology. And this is one of the main reasons why the Soviet Union lost the Cold War to the United States. But with the new technology, it might become, it's not certain, but one of my fears is that the new technology suddenly makes central information processing far more efficient than ever before, and far more efficient than distributed data processing. Because the more data you have in one place, the better your algorithms, and so on and so forth. And this kind of tilts the balance between totalitarianism and democracy in favor of totalitarianism. And I wonder, what are your thoughts on this issue?